welcome to Let's Talk AppSecOps. My name is Mark Lambert, Chief Product Officer at ArmorCode, and I am joined by Nuno Loureiro, CEO and co-founder of 𝗪𝗿𝗿𝗀, one of our great partners in the DAST space. Nuno, did I say that correctly? Was that a good pronunciation?
Perfect.
All right, I feel vindicated. Great. So what we're going to talk about today is DAST and really how we can automate pen testing to a certain extent within our applications to kind of make sure we get complete coverage from a security perspective. And certainly when we think about DAST, we think about web apps, right? That's the first line that we think about when we think about what we can see. The biggest challenge that I've always experienced, Nuno, within this space is kind of like, how do I get my coverage? Because my applications are usually very deep and very expansive, and my QA team has a challenge in touching everything during a QA cycle. So how can I get a tool to do that for me in an automated way? Is that something that you experience with your clients as well?
Yeah, yes, definitely. Well, first of all, thank you, Mark, for having me here. A lot of our clients usually give us good feedback about our crawler, which is basically the component responsible for that good coverage of your applications and for the testing. Our crawler was something that we focused from the beginning since we built 𝗪𝗿𝗿𝗀 because we were aware of that problem with a lot of other DAST scanners out there. And so right now we have Chromium-based headless browser that usually loads the page, waits for events, support all the new stuff within JavaScript and so on. And one of our focus was to actually be able to cover like all the sections of the web application without human interaction. So we can say that our scanner is very point and shoot because of that. We are able, like out of the box, to cover, like a good coverage, or to have a good coverage of your application without human intervention.
All right. So kind of like I think the phrase you used there was point and shoot, and I think that's kind of like always the nirvana state. It's like, hey, I don't want to even have to touch it. I just want to tell it to go over here and do some work. The challenge with that, though, is we start to increase kind of like the volume of data that's thrown at me. So kind of like, point and shoot typically ends up kind of like it's a shotgun. You don't necessarily, you're going to hit the target, but you're going to hit a whole bunch of other areas that aren't important. How do we balance these two things?
Well, we also have implemented some ways to avoid scanning duplicate pages. For instance, we apply, for instance, an algorithm that basically calculates the similarity between two pages, and when it's to a certain degree that we are confident that it's the same structure of the page, then we avoid scanning that, since it's a duplicate. That's one. Another thing that we do is, based on the URL, we automatically apply URL patterns. For instance, like imagine that you have a URL that is like /news/1/news/2 and so on. So we detect that it's like a pattern in the URL, and we already apply a pattern to that, and we only scan like one or two objects or instances of that type of URL.
Okay, so kind of like really focusing down on the volume of data that's sent to somebody, so you don't have repeats and duplicates. And when you're working with clients to kind of really understand the data that they're looking at, how do we ensure that the actual result is a valid a valid issue, right? I mean, I come from the SAST space, right? So static application security testing. And we were always having to talk about false positives, right? That was always a number that a customer was kind of like talking about and saying, okay, well, what's the false positive rate? And there's a whole debate there on that one, which we don't want to get into. But the same occurs when I'm starting to look at a web application, right? I'm like, well, that's not a real scenario. It's not a real problem. What's your experience in that area?
Before probably I used to run an AppSec team and I used DAST scanners, so I suffered a lot from that. And that was one of the other main areas of focus on probably the quality of the results. We are not here playing a game of numbers. We report what we believe that we should report, of course, based on the criticality without increasing the criticality, because it looks better to say that you reported, 10 high risk vulnerabilities than, 1 high risk and 9 medium or low. False positives was a main area of focus. So we apply different techniques in order to avoid false positives. For some types of vulnerabilities, we safely exploit the vulnerability in order to gather an evidence that shows that vulnerability is real. And when we gather that evidence, not only we are 100% sure it's real, but we also give that evidence back to the user, so that by looking at the evidence, they know instantaneously that it's a real vulnerability and not a false positive. Our false positive rate last year was 0.06%, which is really low. We also apply other methods like some heuristics and so on in order to avoid reporting those false positives. We allow the users to report the false positives within our app. And when that happens, that creates a ticket, an issue on our side for our engineering team to investigate. And sometimes the customer is actually not right, and we get back to the customer and tell them that the vulnerability is actually real, and we explain why. Sometimes they are right, and when they are right, we improve our engine in order to avoid reporting a similar false positives in the future.
Yeah,
that's pretty much how we operate.
Yeah, that's a pretty impressive false positive rate, right? I mean, like that's you're really honing in on that, and that to hear that feedback loop about how you're able to get very quick feedback to the customer, I think talks to why you need when you're deploying technology like this, you need a good partner, right? And really, I always think about that as it's really a partnership between the vendor and the user. And that feedback loop that you just highlighted is I think one of the key things as to why Probably, from what we've heard with the customers that are using Probly with ArmorCode, is like you provide that great partnership, and obviously that's a key thing for us as well as we're trying to kind of like book and bring all of this data together. One other thing that kind of like you just got me thinking about is way back in the day, I did a little bit of DAST work as well, and one of the things when I was working with one client is they're like, hey, is this DAST scan going to do anything disruptive, or destructive, should I say? Is it going to delete stuff, blow stuff up? And we said, no, of course it's not. That's the way we designed it. But the client nevertheless said, okay, well, let's run it in production. We're like, no, don't run it in production. But they did, and almost brought down their mainframe because we uncovered a problem in the back end. What is your advice and your strategy as to how somebody should manage their environments for doing DAST scanning? Because obviously you're going to have, a QA environment, pre-prod, load performance testing environments. Many organizations are doing near continuous delivery, right? So doing a DAST scan in the middle of that might not be feasible. But what is your advice to partners as your community as they're rolling out Probly?
So officially, we don't recommend scanning in production because of what you just described. For that same reason, doing our testing, of course, it depends on the application. But since the tests are intrusive, like we are attacking the application. Depending on how your application is developed, we can do something that like we shouldn't. But depends. Like even when you're trying to scan production, it depends on the type of application you have. For instance, if your product leaves behind the login page and each user only sees things that are related to that user and doesn't see like anything else, then it's usually fine to run in production. If on the other hand, for instance, you're scanning an admin back office where, the admin user after logging in can delete other users, can enter content or create new content on the site and so on, that's generally not a good idea to scan in production, of course, because the scanner will delete users, will post comments and do all that. So the best recommendation is to run pre-production. So it really depends on the stage and the frequency you update those environments. Of dev, probably not a good place to run scans unless you do partial scans of, that you only scan what changed and not everything else. Especially if you have a high frequency of new releases. Usually staging or pre-production are more stable, or at least there's less updates, or the frequency is less, and it's a better environment to scan. One thing that is very important when you're scanning, a testing or pre-production environment, is to actually have some data volume there. I can give you an example. Imagine that you have a test environment, but there's no objects created. There's nothing there. Imagine, for instance, you're testing an app that, lists articles, and you have articles like news articles and so on. And once you get like a list of 10, then you have the pager down there so that you can move to the following page and so on. A lot of times you might have a vulnerability on the pager, and if you don't have those 10 objects, you're not going to enable the pager and you're not going to test it. So it's important when you're testing development environments or pre-production environments to actually have some data there, so that the scanner can actually go through like all the parts of the app and scan it properly.
Okay, good. Thank you. And I think that's that last point you made is a really important one, right? Because your web application is what you see is what you test, and if you don't see the pagination, you can't test the pagination. There's another component to that though as well. So we're talking very much about the web, but most applications now, there's an API that sits behind that. The web UI is going to be touching the API. That it represents a significant attack surface. We might also have APIs that are not being leveraged by the UI at all. They're being used for integration purposes, and they're more publicly known, right? They're going to have a Swagger or an Open API document. So we've really got these two classes of APIs that we also need to be thinking about from a DAST perspective, or API security, if you want to put it into that category. Kind of what are your thoughts in that area? How do you approach that with clients?
So you mentioned something important, which is the type of API you're trying to test. If it's an API that is used completely by a web application, that's the best case scenario. You should scan your web app that indirectly will then scan the API. Well, not indirectly, it will directly scan the API by using the web app. And that's usually the best case because we are using real data. So basically, our web app is going to make calls to the API with with the proper values for all the attributes and so on. And that's very important. When you're testing an API, you want to be able to make a successful request that returns a successful response. You want to retrieve an object that exists in your database. And of course, since the web app has that context, that's the best case scenario to scan your API. When in cases where you just have an API that is being used by integrators or something like that, that is not fully used by a web app, then you can scan the API based off the Swagger or Open API schema file or from a Postman collection. So we probably have those two options. And when you scan an API based on the schema file, then you have that problem about the inputs, like what input should I use here? Like on the spec, on the schema, it says that it's an integer, but like if I retrieve the user 1, it might not exist, for instance, and you get a 404, you want to make a request to the user that exists. So you, like with Probably, you can either set custom values. Also in your schema file, if like there's a way on the schema file to set examples for each endpoint and each value, we honor those. So if you define it in the schema, we'll use those. If not, you can manually enter them on Probably as a custom value. But one good thing that we do as well is, so when we get responses from the API, we usually get some data, some attributes, some information, right? Like for instance, imagine that we are retrieving a user profile, and as input, you give the ID, and then in the response, you get back the name, email, and so on. We'll keep track of those values that are returned. And whenever we see another endpoint that uses any of those attributes, we'll reuse the attributes that were returned from previous calls. All of these to maximize the chance or the likelihood to be like to get a successful request response.
Yeah, that context is always the challenge when you're just looking at a blank, Swagger document, right, with no contract definition.
One other thing that is important that I forgot has to do with the order that you have on your schema file. So for instance, imagine that you have an endpoint to retrieve an object, so a get, and then you also have with another method to delete the object. So we'll move all delete actions to the end of the scan, because if you're deleting an object and then you're going to try to retrieve that object, you're not going to have a success. So we move all those more destructive operations to the end of the scan in order to maximize the success of the scan.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense, right? You do that, create the object, do something with the object, then delete the object, and be able to kind of like validate those pieces. So very cool. Well, thanks very much for the time today. We're kind of like right at the top of the session. If folks want to learn more about the Probably integration with ArmorCode, we have that right there within the platform, so we can bring the data from Probly along with all of the other findings and vulnerabilities that you're ingesting from both your AppSec program as well as your infrastructure vulnerability management. How do folks find out more about Probly? What's the next step?
I mean, you can go to probably.com and you can sign up. We have a free plan, free forever plan, and you can start scanning.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we'll put those links in the show notes. Thanks everybody for watching. Click like, subscribe, usual thing. Check out the next podcast coming soon. Nuno, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I'm glad we could make this work. We've been trying to get this working for a couple of months now, so really glad we could make this work. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, take care, everybody. Be safe.